Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto stood on the bridge of I-58 inches, the pre-dawn darkness of July 30th, 1945, approximately 200 miles east of the Philippines. His submarine had been at sea for 11 days, hunting American shipping in waters that had once been Japan's domain. Through his binoculars, he could see something massive cutting through the water ahead. A capital ship, unescorted, zigzagging but making good speed directly toward his position. He could hardly believe his fortune. In the fourth year of the Pacific War, American vessels rarely traveled alone. Their convoys bristled with destroyers and escort carriers. Their aircraft patrolled constantly. Their sonar and radar made submarine operations increasingly suicidal. But here, impossibly, was what appeared to be a heavy cruiser, or possibly even a battleship, moving without protection through the Philippine Sea. Hashimoto ordered his crew to battle stations. The submarine's diesel engines shut down. Electric motors engaged, pulling I-58 beneath the surface. The boat settled at perimeter depth. Through the periscope, Hashimoto tracked the target. It was indeed a heavy cruiser, American, making approximately 17 knots. The range closed to 1,500 meters. Perfect firing position. He gave the order. 6 Type 95 torpedoes launched from I-58's forward tubes. The chitin human-guided torpedoes remained in their racks. This was a conventional attack against a conventional target. Hashimoto watched through the periscope as the torpedoes ran true. 2 struck the cruiser's starboard side. Massive explosions erupted from the hull. The ship listed immediately, taking on water through wounds torn below the waterline. Hashimoto ordered I-58 to dive deep and withdraw. He had no way of knowing he had just sunk the USS Indianapolis, fresh from delivering components for the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima 6 days later. He had no way of knowing that of the 1,200 men aboard Indianapolis, only 316 would survive the sinking and the days that followed in shark-infested waters. He knew only that he had accomplished what Japanese submariners were increasingly unable to do. He had sunk a major American warship. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This success was remarkable not for its tactical execution, which was textbook, but for its rarity. By late 1945, Japanese submarines had become almost irrelevant to the Pacific War. They operated in waters dominated by American forces. They faced anti-submarine warfare capabilities that had evolved dramatically since Pearl Harbor. Most critically, they were few in number and growing fewer. When Hashimoto returned to port and reported his kill, Japanese Naval Command celebrated the sinking as proof that their submarine force still had teeth. But the celebration was hollow. Everyone involved knew the truth. One cruiser sunk after years of diminishing returns. One success in a campaign that had failed to achieve any of its strategic objectives. The question that haunted Japanese submarine commanders was simple and terrible. How had it come to this? How had a submarine force that began the war with confidence and capability been reduced to such marginality? The answer lay not in tactics or training or courage. It lay in numbers. It lay in industrial capacity. It lay in strategic choices made years earlier that could not be undone. Japan entered the Pacific War with 63 submarines operational or under construction. This was not an accident of circumstance. This was the deliberate result of naval doctrine developed over 2 decades of planning. The Imperial Japanese Navy viewed submarines as fleet weapons, not commerce raiders. Their primary mission was to engage enemy warships, to thin the American battle line before the fiver, and decisive surface engagement that Japanese naval planners believed would determine the war's outcome. This philosophy had deep roots in Japanese naval thinking. After studying the lessons of World War I, where German U-boats had nearly starved Britain through merchant shipping interdiction, Japanese planners concluded that Japan's situation was fundamentally different. Japan needed to win quickly, to establish a defensive perimeter, and to make the cost of dislodging them prohibitive for the Americans. This required destroying American warships, not American cargo vessels. The submarines Japan built reflected this doctrine. The I-class submarines were large, capable boats designed for long-range operations in support of the fleet. I-15 class submarines displaced 1,900 tons surfaced, 2,400 tons submerged. They carried 6 torpedo tubes, mounted a 14-centimeter deck gun, and could operate for 90 days without refueling. Their range was 14,000 nautical miles at 16 knots surfaced. These were impressive specifications by any standard. American fleet submarines of the Gato class, by comparison, displaced 1,500 tons surfaced, 1,900 tons submerged, with a range of 11,000 nautical miles at 10 knots surfaced. The Japanese boats were larger, longer ranged, and in many ways more capable as individual platforms. Japanese submarine crews trained extensively. Officers attended the submarine school at Kure, studying tactics, engineering, and navigation. Crew members drilled endlessly on torpedo attacks, crash dives, and damage control. The Imperial Navy emphasized jinshin, spirit, and technical excellence in equal measure. Submariners were elite, volunteers who had proven themselves capable of operating in the most demanding environment the Navy offered. The pre-war plan was elegant in its simplicity. When war came, Japanese submarines would deploy to intercept the American fleet as it steamed west from Pearl Harbor to relieve the Philippines. The submarines would attack in waves, sinking battleships and carriers, forcing the Americans to fight the decisive battle with reduced strength. Combined with land-based aircraft and the surface fleet, this attrition warfare would give Japan the advantage in the climactic engagement near the Philippines. It was a plan built on assumptions about how the war would unfold. The Americans would fight a traditional naval campaign. They would seek a decisive battle. They would operate their fleet in ways that made it vulnerable to submarine attack. Every element of Japanese submarine doctrine, every design choice, every training priority flowed from these assumptions. When the assumptions proved wrong, the entire structure collapsed. The United States entered the Pacific War with a submarine force that was, on paper, inferior to Japan's in several respects. American fleet submarines were smaller individually. Their torpedoes, the Mark 14, had severe technical problems that would not be fully resolved until late 1943. Their doctrine was unclear, split between those who advocated fleet support missions and those who argued for commerce raiding. But America had something Japan lacked: industrial capacity on a scale that defied comprehension. The Electric Boat Company in Groton, Connecticut, had been building submarines since 1900. Their facility could produce submarines using assembly line techniques adapted from automotive manufacturing. The Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine, had built submarines for the Navy since 1917. Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California and Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company in Wisconsin added their capacity to submarine construction when war came. These facilities did not just build submarines. They mass-produced them. Electric Boat could lay down a new submarine every month when operating at peak capacity. Portsmouth could match that rate. The construction process was standardized. Hulls were welded rather than riveted, reducing construction time. Components were manufactured by subcontractors and delivered to shipyards for assembly. Diesel engines came from General Motors and Fairbanks Morse. Electric motors from General Electric and Westinghouse. Batteries from Exide. Periscopes from Kollmorgen. Torpedoes from Naval Torpedo Station Newport and Naval Ordnance Plant Forest Park. The entire American industrial economy could be mobilized for war production in ways Japan's economy could not match. Steel mills in Pittsburgh and Gary produced the special high-tensile steel needed for pressure hulls. Rolling mills shaped the steel into plates. Fabrication shops cut and formed components. Everything moved with clockwork efficiency from raw materials to finished submarines ready for sea trials. When Admiral Chester Nimitz took command of the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor, he recognized immediately that submarine warfare would be critical. but not the kind of submarine warfare Japanese doctrine emphasized. American submarines would attack Japanese merchant shipping. They would strangle Japan's economy by cutting the sea lanes that brought oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, and raw materials from throughout the co-prosperity sphere. This required submarines in quantity. Not just the 63 boats Japan had, but hundreds of submarines operating simultaneously across the entire Pacific. It required replacing losses quickly. It required refitting boats with improved equipment as technology evolved. It required a logistics network that could support submarines at forward bases from Australia to Pearl Harbor to Midway. American shipyards delivered. In 1942, they completed 29 new fleet submarines. In 1943, they completed 55. In 1944, they completed 81. In 1945, before the war ended in August, they completed 38 more. The total, 203 new fleet submarines built during the war years, not counting the 73 already in service when the war began. The mathematics were brutal. Japan started with 63 submarines. America built 203 while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war, supporting submarine operations in the Atlantic against Germany, while conducting the primary submarine campaign in the Pacific against Japan. The disparity was not just numerical, it was philosophical. It represented entirely different understandings of how industrial warfare functioned in the 20th century. The disconnect between Japanese submarine doctrine and operational reality became apparent within weeks of Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, 27 Japanese submarines were deployed around Hawaii to intercept American warships fleeing the attack. They sank one vessel, the cargo ship Cynthia Olson, carrying lumber from Tacoma to Honolulu. No American warships were caught by the submarine cordon. The entire operational concept had failed its first test. Japanese submarine commanders found themselves operating under constraints that made their missions nearly impossible. Naval headquarters insisted on maintaining radio contact, requiring submarines to surface regularly to receive and transmit messages. This exposed them to American aircraft and direction-finding equipment. The doctrine of attacking warships meant submarines passed up opportunities to sink merchant vessels, adhering to orders that prioritized capital ships, even when cargo ships presented easier targets. The I-class submarines, impressive as individual platforms, had characteristics that made them poorly suited for the actual conditions of Pacific submarine warfare. They were large, which made them easier to detect. Their diesel engines were powerful but loud, audible on American sonar at ranges where smaller submarines might go, undetected. Their crews, trained to operate in coordinated attacks against warships, found themselves conducting independent patrols in hostile waters where coordination was impossible. Lieutenant Commander Toshitake Ueno, commanding I-26, experienced the frustration directly. On December 20th, 1941, he encountered the American aircraft carrier Saratoga off Hawaii. He fired torpedoes. All missed. Saratoga's escorting destroyers counterattacked with depth charges. I-26 dove deep and escaped, but Ueno's report revealed the problem. American anti-submarine warfare was far more capable than pre-war intelligence had indicated. Japanese submarines achieved some notable successes in the war's first year. I-6 sank 2 merchant ships near Australia. I-19 torpedoed the carrier Wasp and the destroyer O'Brien in September 1942, a remarkable double success. I-26 damaged Saratoga in January 1942, putting her out of action for months. But these successes were scattered, opportunistic, not the sustained campaign against the American battle line that doctrine demanded. The submarines themselves suffered mounting losses. I-73 was sunk by American aircraft in January 1942. I-69 disappeared in April. I-28 was lost in May. I-only 123 inches, June. The pattern continued month after month. Japanese submarines went on patrol and did not return. Sometimes there were reports of depth charge attacks, Sometimes radio contact simply ceased, and the submarine was listed as missing, presumed lost. By mid-1943, Japanese submarine operations had shifted from fleet support to increasingly desperate missions. Submarines were tasked with supplying isolated island garrisons, running food and ammunition to troops that could no longer be reached by surface vessels. The I-class boats, designed for offensive operations, were reduced to cargo carriers, their torpedo rooms filled with rice and medical supplies instead of weapons. Commander Teruhisa Komatsu, commanding I-177, transported supplies to Bougainville in August 1943. His submarine surfaced at night near the island to transfer cargo. American PT boats detected the submarine and attacked. I-177 crash-dived but was damaged by depth charges. Komatsu managed to return to base, but his report was damning. The Americans controlled the sea and air so completely that even supply runs were becoming suicidal. The strategic situation deteriorated further as American forces captured island bases closer to Japan. Submarines that once operated from Truk or Rabaul now had to transit longer distances under constant threat. American anti-submarine aircraft, equipped with radar and improved depth charges, hunted Japanese submarines systematically. American destroyers, trained specifically for submarine warfare, worked in coordinated groups that made submarine operations in forward areas almost impossible. Japanese submarine losses accelerated. In 1943, Japan lost 22 submarines. In 1944, they lost 30. The force that had begun the war with 63 boats was being ground down through attrition that could not be replaced. Japanese shipyards lacked the capacity to build submarines quickly enough to offset losses. Even when new boats were completed, they faced the same operational constraints and the same increasingly lethal anti-submarine warfare environment. By late 1944, the Japanese submarine force was a shadow of its pre-war strength. Fewer than 30 submarines remained operational. Their missions were increasingly limited to supply runs and desperate attempts to slow the American advance. The doctrine of attacking warships had been abandoned. The crews, once elite volunteers, were often inexperienced replacements for the skilled submariners lost in earlier operations. The strategic impact of Japanese submarines on the Pacific War had become negligible. While Japanese submarine capability declined, American submarine operations expanded into the most successful submarine campaign in naval history. The numbers were extraordinary, not just in vessel construction but in operational effectiveness. American submarines operating from bases at Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, Brisbane, and Midway conducted coordinated patrols across the entire Western Pacific. The Gato-class submarines that formed the backbone of the American effort were purpose-built for long-range operations. They displaced 1,507 tons surfaced, 1,912 tons submerged. Length was 311 feet 6 inches. Beam was 27 feet 3 inches. They carried 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward, 4 aft. A typical patrol loadout was 24 Mark 14 torpedoes, though this varied based on mission requirements. The crew complement was 6 officers and 54 enlisted men, significantly more than Japanese submarines of comparable displacement. This allowed proper watch rotation and meant that crew members could focus on specific tasks rather than handling multiple roles. The American boats had air conditioning, critical for operations in tropical waters, where heat and humidity could make internal conditions unbearable. They had refrigeration for food storage, allowing patrols lasting 60 days or more without relying on canned rations exclusively. Electric Boat Company in Groton had refined submarine construction to a precise science. A new Gato-class boat required approximately 1 year from keel laying to commissioning, though this time decreased as production techniques improved. The hull sections were fabricated separately and then welded together. This was faster than the riveted construction some navies still used, and produced a stronger pressure hull capable of diving to 300 feet operational depth, with crush depth estimated at around 500 feet. The construction process employed thousands of workers. Electric boats' workforce expanded from 2,500 in 1940 to 13,000 by 1943. Women comprised approximately 20% of the workforce, performing welding, electrical work, and precision machining. The shipyard operated 3 shifts, 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery, Maine, followed similar procedures. Their construction docks could accommodate multiple submarines simultaneously. They built 53 submarines during the war, an average of more than 1 per month during peak production periods. Mare Island in California built 17. Manitowoc Shipbuilding Company in Wisconsin, located on Lake Michigan, built 28 submarines that had to be transported down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico before entering service. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The logistics of American submarine operations were equally impressive. Forward bases required extensive infrastructure, repair facilities, torpedo storage, fuel tanks, provisions warehouses, communications equipment, and housing for relief crews. Submarine Base Pearl Harbor was a self-contained industrial complex capable of refitting submarines between patrols, repairing battle damage, and maintaining boats in combat-ready condition. Commander Richard O'Kane, commanding USS Tang, experienced this support system firsthand. Tang completed 5 patrols between January and October 1944, sinking 33 confirmed Japanese ships. Between patrols, Tang returned to Pearl Harbor or Midway for refit. Damaged equipment was replaced. Torpedoes were reloaded. Fresh provisions were brought aboard. The crew received rest and recreation. Within 2 weeks, Tang was ready for sea again. This operational tempo was only possible because of the industrial and logistical system supporting it. American submarines operated with the confidence that replacements were available for any equipment failure, that ammunition was plentiful, that support was consistent. Japanese submarines operated with the knowledge that any significant damage might end their operational life because repair facilities were limited and replacement parts scarce. American submarine tactics evolved based on operational experience in ways Japanese tactics could not. When the Mark 14 torpedo proved defective in early war patrols, American submarine commanders reported the problems persistently. By late 1943, the Bureau of Ordnance had corrected the depth-keeping mechanism, the magnetic exploder, and the contact exploder. The improved torpedo was devastatingly effective. American submarines began operating in coordinated wolf packs by mid-1943, a tactic borrowed from German U-boat operations in the Atlantic. Multiple submarines patrolled assigned areas, sharing contact information via radio. When one boat located a convoy, others converged to attack from multiple directions. This coordination was possible because American submarines had reliable radios and secure communications codes. The results were catastrophic for Japanese merchant shipping. In 1942, American submarines sank approximately 580,000 tons of Japanese merchant vessels. In 1943, 1.8 million tons. In 1944, 2.7 million tons. By war's end, American submarines had sunk over 50% of all Japanese merchant vessels lost during the war, approximately 1,300 ships totaling 5 million tons. The strategic impact of this disparity became undeniable by late 1944. Japan's economy depended entirely on maritime transportation. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore from the Philippines, coal from Manchuria, rice from Indochina, all moved by merchant ship through sea lanes that American submarines now controlled. When those ships stopped arriving, Japan's industrial production collapsed. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto understood this reality better than most. Between his successful sinking of Indianapolis and his earlier patrols, he had witnessed the transformation of the Pacific. In his memoir published after the war, he described the experience, "By 1944, we knew we were not winning. Every patrol showed us fewer targets, more American patrols, and greater danger. We knew our merchant ships were not reaching home ports. We knew our military supplies were running out. The psychological impact on Japanese submarine crews was crushing. They had trained to be elite warriors, to engage enemy warships in decisive combat. Instead, they found themselves running supply missions to isolated garrisons, operating in waters where every surfacing risked immediate attack, watching their sister boats disappear one by one. The submarines themselves remained capable machines, but capability meant nothing without targets, without support, without a strategic framework that made their missions meaningful. Lieutenant Zenji Orita, serving aboard I-47, recorded his experiences in diary entries later published as a historical account. On March 15, 1945, he wrote, "We received orders to transport supplies to Iwo Jima. The island has already fallen to the Americans. The supplies will not arrive. We will likely not survive. Yet we follow orders because there is nothing else to do." The contrast with American submarine operations was total. Commander Eugene Fluckey, commanding USS Barb, conducted offensive patrols into Japanese home waters in early 1945. On January 23, he penetrated Namquan Harbor on the Chinese coast, sank a transport ship, and escaped under heavy fire. On February 11, he entered the approaches to Tokyo Bay, sank several ships within sight of the Japanese capital, and withdrew successfully. On June 22, he landed a shore party on Sakhalin Island to destroy Japanese installations. These were offensive operations conducted in waters Japan considered its own territory. They were possible because American submarines operated with overwhelming material superiority, reliable equipment, abundant torpedoes, excellent intelligence, and the confidence that if damaged, they could return to bases with repair facilities capable of fixing anything short of total destruction. The final accounting was devastating. Japan entered the war with 63 submarines. During the war, they completed approximately 60 additional boats, bringing total strength to around 123 submarines over the entire conflict period. They lost 129 submarines to enemy action, accidents, and scuttling before surrender. The survival rate was effectively zero. America entered the war with 73 submarines. They built 203 more during the war years. They lost 52 to all causes. More submarines were built than were lost by a ratio of nearly 4-1. At war's end, the United States Navy operated more submarines than existed in any other navy worldwide. But numbers alone do not capture the strategic collapse. Japanese submarines failed to achieve their primary mission. They did not significantly reduce American naval capability. American submarines succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. They destroyed Japan's merchant marine, strangled its economy, and made impossible the strategic defense of the Pacific perimeter that Japanese war plans required. Commander Hashimoto, standing on I-58's bridge after sinking Indianapolis, believed briefly that he had struck a meaningful blow. When he learned months later that Indianapolis had been carrying atomic bomb components, he understood the bitter irony. His greatest success had come too late to matter. The war was already lost, not through any failure of courage or tactical skill, but through the simple mathematics of industrial capacity. America could build submarines faster than Japan could sink them. Japan could not replace submarines faster than America destroyed them. Everything else followed from that fundamental imbalance. The men who served aboard Japanese submarines paid the price for strategic failures they did not create and could not correct. Of the approximately 15,000 Japanese submariners who served during the war, more than 10,000 died. This casualty rate of approximately 67% was among the highest of any military service branch in any nation during World War II. They died in boats crushed by depth charges, suffocated when damaged submarines could not surface, drowned when hulls ruptured under pressure, or incinerated when fuel tanks exploded. Commander Hashimoto survived the war. I-58 returned to base after sinking Indianapolis and conducted one more patrol before the surrender. Hashimoto was present at Yokosuka Naval Base on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announced Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. He later testified at the court-martial of Captain Charles McVeigh, commander of Indianapolis, providing technical details about the attack. The U.S. Navy convicted McVeigh of hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag, though Hashimoto's testimony stated that zigzagging would not have prevented the attack. McVeigh committed suicide in 1968, never recovering from the conviction and the loss of his crew. Lieutenant Orita survived aboard I-47, which was surrendered to American forces at the end of the war. He spent months in prisoner-of-war camps before repatriation to Japan. In his post-war writings, he described the psychological burden of surviving when so many comrades had not. "We who lived carried the memory of those who died in steel coffins beneath the sea. They died following orders, believing in their mission, trusting their superiors. They deserved better than what they received." The physical submarines met various fates. Most Japanese submarines were scuttled by American forces in Operation Road's End, beginning in April 1946. Submarines were towed to deep water near Goto Islands and sunk with explosive charges. The U.S. Navy wanted to prevent any submarine technology transfer to potential adversaries and to ensure Japanese submarines could not be salvaged and returned to service. I-58 was scuttled on April 1, 1946, in waters 2,000 feet deep. A few Japanese submarines were preserved for technical evaluation. I-400 and I-401, enormous submarines capable of carrying aircraft, were studied extensively at Pearl Harbor and Mare Island before being scuttled off Hawaii in 1946. The Americans were particularly interested in the aircraft hangar design and catapult launch systems, though these capabilities proved to have no practical application in the post-war era of longer-range land-based aircraft and aircraft carriers. American submarines faced a different post-war reality. The fleet that had won the Pacific Submarine War was largely obsolete by 1950. Nuclear propulsion, developed in the 1950s, rendered diesel-electric submarines obsolete for major naval powers. USS Nautilus, the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, was commissioned in 1954. She could remain submerged indefinitely, limited only by crew endurance and food supplies, rather than battery capacity or air quality. Many American fleet submarines were transferred to Allied navies under military assistance programs. The Italian Navy received Barb in 1954, renaming her Enrico Tazzoli. She served until 1972, nearly 3 decades after her launching. The Spanish Navy received Kraken in 1959. The Turkish Navy received Mero in 1954. These submarines, obsolete by American standards, provided valuable service to nations that could not afford nuclear submarines. Some American submarines were preserved as memorials. USS Bowfin, launched 1 year after Pearl Harbor, is permanently moored at Pearl Harbor as a museum ship. USS Pampanito in San Francisco, USS Cod in Cleveland, USS Lionfish in Fall River, Massachusetts, and others serve as tangible reminders of the submarine war. Visitors can walk through the cramped compartments, see the torpedo rooms and control stations, and understand in physical terms what submarine warfare demanded of its crews. Commander O'Kane survived the war despite Tang's loss on her 5th patrol. A circular run by one of Tang's own torpedoes struck the submarine, sinking her with heavy loss of life. O'Kane and 8 other survivors were captured by Japanese forces and endured brutal treatment as prisoners of war. He received the Medal of Honor for Tang's final action and lived until 1994, spending decades advocating for submarine veterans and ensuring their stories were preserved. The disparity between Japanese and American submarine forces revealed fundamental truths about industrial warfare that extended far beyond submarine operations alone. The Pacific War was decided not primarily by tactical brilliance or superior fighting spirit, but by material production capacity and the ability to sustain military operations across vast distances over extended time. Japan's strategic planning before the war had been based on assumptions that proved catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners believed that fighting spirit and tactical excellence could compensate for industrial inferiority. They believed that a defensive perimeter, once established, could be held against American counterattacks. They believed that America lacked the will to sustain a long war in the Pacific while simultaneously fighting Germany in Europe. Every assumption was incorrect. The submarine campaign demonstrated this with mathematical precision. Japan began with 93% as many submarines as America had at war's start, 63 Japanese boats versus 73 American. By war's end, America operated 276 submarines, while Japan had fewer than 30 still capable of operations. The ratio had shifted from near parity to 9-1 American advantage. This transformation occurred while America was building thousands of other ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, millions of tons of vehicles and equipment, all while maintaining and expanding the submarine force. The strategic impact was equally clear. Japanese submarines sank approximately 184 Allied vessels, totaling approximately 900,000 tons during the entire war. These were primarily merchant ships, with a handful of warships including the carriers Wasp and Yorktown, the cruiser Juneau, and Indianapolis. The losses were significant, but did not materially affect Allied operations. Supply lines remained open. American forces never lacked for equipment, ammunition, or provisions due to submarine attacks. American submarines, by contrast, sank 1,314 Japanese vessels, totaling 5.3 million tons. They destroyed 55% of all Japanese merchant vessels lost during the war. They sank 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and over 200 naval auxiliary vessels. They rescued 504 downed aviators who would have otherwise been lost. They conducted reconnaissance missions that provided intelligence for major operations. They placed mines in Japanese waters. They transported supplies to guerrilla forces in the Philippines. They evacuated civilians and military personnel from besieged positions. The economic impact on Japan was catastrophic. By 1945, Japanese industry was starving for raw materials. Oil imports from the Dutch East Indies had ceased. Rubber from Malaya was unavailable. Iron ore and coal shipments from China and Manchuria had been reduced to a fraction of pre-war levels. Factories that had produced aircraft and weapons in 1942 were idle by 1945 for lack of materials. Even food supplies became critical, with rice imports from Indochina cut off by submarine interdiction. This strangulation was methodical and complete. American submarines operated in coordinated campaigns targeting specific trade routes. The Luzon Strait between Taiwan and the Philippines became known as Convoy College because of the concentrated submarine attacks on vessels moving through this critical choke point. The South China Sea, once safe waters for Japanese shipping, became a hunting ground where American submarines sank tankers, bringing oil from Borneo and Sumatra. The approaches to major Japanese ports were mined and patrolled, making even domestic coastal shipping hazardous. Japanese naval leadership recognized the catastrophic nature of these losses, but could do nothing effective to stop them. Anti-submarine warfare required escorts, aircraft, training, and doctrine that Japan had not developed before the war and could not develop quickly enough during it. Japanese destroyer forces, needed desperately for convoy escort, were instead committed to offensive operations and fleet actions. By the time Japanese doctrine shifted to emphasize convoy protection, it was too late. There were not enough escorts, not enough trained crews, not enough fuel to operate the escorts that did exist. The contrast in strategic priorities was stark. America had planned for submarine warfare against commerce from the beginning, developing doctrine, equipment, and training programs before the war started. Japan had planned for fleet actions and neglected merchant shipping protection. When the war came, America executed its submarine campaign with devastating effectiveness. Japan attempted to respond but lacked the resources, infrastructure, and time to develop an adequate defense. This pattern repeated across every aspect of the Pacific War. American industrial capacity enabled sustained operations that Japanese industry could not match. American logistics supported forces across vast distances that Japanese logistics could not reach. American production replaced losses and expanded capabilities, while Japanese production struggled to maintain existing force levels. The submarine campaign was simply the clearest example of a fundamental imbalance that determined the war's outcome. When Commander Hashimoto stood on I-58's bridge in those pre-dawn hours of July 30th, 1945, watching his torpedoes strike Indianapolis, he believed briefly that he was contributing to Japan's defense. He had done what Japanese submarine doctrine demanded. He had sunk an enemy warship. By the standards of his training and his service, he had succeeded brilliantly. Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser, a capital ship, exactly the type of target Japanese submarines had been designed to engage. But success in tactical terms meant nothing when the strategic situation was irreversible. Indianapolis was one cruiser among hundreds of American warships operating in the Pacific. Her loss did not delay American operations by a single day. The atomic bomb components she had delivered reached their destination. The bombs were assembled and dropped as planned. Japan surrendered 2 weeks after Hashimoto's attack, not because of anything Japanese submarines had accomplished, but because American industrial and military power had made continued resistance pointless. The irony was profound. Japanese submarines, individually capable and manned by skilled crews, achieved almost nothing strategically because there were too few of them, and they operated under doctrine that targeted the wrong objectives. American submarines, initially plagued by defective torpedoes and unclear doctrine, became the most effective submarine force in naval history because there were enough of them, because they targeted commerce rather than warships, and because American industry could build submarines faster than Japan could sink them. This was the lesson that Japanese submariners learned too late and at terrible cost. Industrial capacity matters more than individual courage. Strategic planning matters more than tactical skill. Numbers matter. Logistics matter. The ability to sustain operations over years matters more than the ability to achieve isolated victories. Every Japanese submariner who died in the Pacific died serving a strategy that could not succeed, operating equipment that could not be replaced, fighting a war that mathematics had already decided. The men who served aboard American submarines understood their advantage. They operated knowing that behind them was an industrial system that would provide whatever they needed. Their boats were comfortable by submarine standards, properly equipped, adequately supplied. When they returned from patrol, maintenance crews repaired their submarines professionally. When equipment failed, replacements were available. When torpedoes were expended, new ones were loaded. The certainty of support made offensive operations possible. The abundance of resources made aggressive tactics practical. The final accounting was not just numerical, it was human. 10,000 Japanese submariners died. 3,500 American submariners died. Both numbers were terrible, representing young men who died in steel tubes beneath the ocean, often with no opportunity to fight back, no chance of rescue, no hope of survival once their submarines were fatally damaged. But the Japanese died in a losing cause, their sacrifices achieving nothing strategically. The Americans died in a winning campaign, their sacrifices contributing directly to victory. Commander Hashimoto lived with this knowledge for the rest of his life. He testified truthfully at Captain McVeigh's court-martial, stating facts that should have exonerated the American officer. He corresponded with Indianapolis survivors, expressing his respect for their service and his regret for their suffering. He participated in historical conferences and interviews, providing details about Japanese submarine operations that helped historians understand the Pacific War. He died in November 2000, at age 91, one of the last surviving Japanese submarine commanders. His career and his survival were anomalies. Most Japanese submarine commanders died during the war. Most Japanese submarines were lost with all hands. The service that began the war with confidence and capable equipment ended it with near-total casualties and strategic irrelevance. This was not because Japanese submariners lacked courage or skill. It was because Japan lacked the industrial capacity to wage modern war against an opponent that possessed that capacity in abundance. When American shipyards built 203 submarines while fighting 2 ocean wars, they demonstrated something more significant than engineering capability. They demonstrated that modern industrial warfare rewards production volume, logistical sustainment, and strategic planning over tactical excellence or fighting spirit. Japan never understood this truth, or understood it too late to matter. The submarine campaign was simply the clearest demonstration of this fundamental reality. America built submarines in quantities that made tactical defeats irrelevant. Japan could not build submarines in quantities sufficient to achieve strategic objectives. Everything else followed from that basic imbalance. The submarines themselves are mostly gone now, scrapped or scuttled decades ago. A few remain as museums, teaching new generations about what submarine warfare demanded of those who fought it. But the lesson remains relevant. In industrial warfare between modern nations, material capacity determines outcomes. Courage, training, tactical skill, and individual heroism matter, but they cannot overcome fundamental disparities in production, logistics, and sustainment. The men who died aboard Japanese submarines learned this truth too late. The men who survived carried that knowledge forward, ensuring that future generations would understand what they had experienced and what it had cost them to learn it. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.